A hútron Coluderal Scoile DCU, members of the diplomatic corps, and of course I very much agree with you, President, as well, recognizing the presence of Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Ukraine. I do want to say that what we have to say in relation to climate change and consequences and its devastation, standing as immediate background to it, is the devastation and the destruction of lives and homes and communities by actions that are entirely illegal, a breach of every principle of international law, and which are, of course, a gesture of that dangerous tendency in history of imperialist tendency and the abuse of the most powerful on the basis of the simple position of capacity of destruction. I also welcome the member, Professor Murphy, my Council of State is here, and so many others. Very particularly, you have said it is a very great pleasure to, at any time, to be back in a university. And I say to you, President, and these wonderful innovations that you have are very, very much to be admired. I should tell you, when I was last speaking about universities, I suggested that in the first year of the university experience, there should be modules, one particular course at least, saying, what is the purpose of the university experience? And I'm very happy to say that it has been responded to by University College Cork, who have introduced a module in that regard for all those who will be enrolling this year. And I most encourage this debate about the future of the universities. It's a matter on which you could say I have had a special interest. The reason I am here, agus féidir Morocco bhfuil áthas an dáram, a bhéilíomh trónón agus muid a heola lára na déráide, agus soci, agus the cuid ulscoil cóthraháileach clia go hiithigh. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today as we formally launch Dublin City's University new Centre for Climate and Society. I do want to take the opportunity to thank the President for his kind remarks and also for the invitation to address you at today's event. I'm aware we had scheduled this event before, but due to COVID and other events, it had to be rescheduled from last November. The Centre's creation follows the launch at the Masters in Climate Change Policy, Media and Society in DCU 3 years ago. And it has brought that became hugely popular. It was very successful. And building upon DCU's academic strengths, as well as the President has outlined, on governance and law, communications and media, business and education, the new Centre for Climate and Society aims importantly to provide an all-important humanities and social science perspective to the challenge of climate change. I might have a word more to say about that, is that I'd very much like philosophy to be added into the mix, because what is called social science or the social studies very much needs an injection, if you like, of philosophical thinking, which, and I have to say good news in relation to that. In another universities, well, Sabina and I have been promoting, with the assistance of the members of the philosophy department, the Young Philosopher of the Year project. And it fits very neatly and easily alongside the Young Scientist of the Year. The climate and diversity research that emanates from the physical sciences is, of course, a bedrock. We are reminded of the importance of scientific discovery by our experience of COVID. But while the physical science is, of course, a bedrock and is fundamental to our understanding of the nature, causes and consequences of climate change and the importance of biodiversity loss, ultimately climate action requires us all to play our part to mitigate it and adapt to that which is already occurring. And this entails governments introducing policies across a range of areas, regulatory, fiscal, educational, and they're all necessary to help us all to make the informed transition to a low-carbon, sustainable future. I was very struck by your reference to Seamus Heaney's work, and particularly his reference to hope. I struggle in relation to taking that piece of Heaney's now, because, and I will leave it for another day, but it isn't that we're on the precipice, I think, of a great destruction in relation to the natural world. But when you think about it, as I opened by making reference to what is taking place, let us say, in Ukraine, also what is taking place in relation to the diminution of the influence of multilateral institutions and international law. And if you like, the debate which is now over between, if you like, the possibilities of rational, that moment of hope that we had in thought, when we could really move past what I've often called the Cartesian error, in relation of just thinking we could reduce our experience in the world of what is measurable. We're in a much worse state now, and therefore it is in that sense I struggle for hope. I have restrained myself from describing our position across so many failures of democracy, participation, law, dignity, respect for nature, as perhaps it isn't people now say we will be regarded as criminals in the future by future generations. I think we might begin to think about consequences of a species failure. As I said, a dimension to which I might return again in another place. Getting back to my task, and that for which I've been asked to be here, I do say that this centre is so important for because it is aiming to address the very demands of policy that I have mentioned. The importance of media, and again, in many cases, in relation to great failure. Is it a great success that a multi-billionaire would be now deciding what is appropriate for people to exchange by way of discourse? I think it can hardly be described as anything other than a manifestation of an incredible and dangerous narcissism. I think that's it. I think that the centre will correctly be dealing with issues of not just of the policy areas, but also issues of how they're communicated. It's a very good word, President, of yours, how they're embedded, if you like, in what is taken for granted world of people's minds. Politics as well, where if we could at least have a transcendental moment where such progress as we're making is not dragged apart and reduced to narrow interests. Education and business and environmental literacy. Business is interesting because, of course, I was present in Brazil in 1992 for the Great United Nations Conference when the Business Council of Sustainable Development came into being. The business sector are among the rapid, they're wonderful at seeing what is coming, and therefore they decided that they would bring the Business Council for Sustainable Development into being because sustainable was the new word. And thus it was chaired by the president of Nestle, and the vice chair was the president of Fiat, and they were given full status on the platform. And in the same time I was there, I interviewed the people from the Pacific Islands who were the most at risk. I interviewed them on the Greenpeace board. They weren't represented directly on the platform, but the Business Council of Sustainable Development was given full representation by Maurice Strong, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Moving on, and I think that there are a wide range of perspectives from different research areas, all of which are valuable. And the centre aims to bring a focus to environmental communications, to journalism, to what might be called, if you like, the greening of the media generally, which is a very different development from the idea of a single person deciding to have a monopoly on an area of communications. I think green finance, marketing, and corporate approaches, and these are all very important. And I am sure that what will come from the centre are innovative and just, because basically what I have to say in the main purpose of the remarks this morning is the urgency of the paradigm change that we need in relation to so many different areas. I do agree in what I've read of Dr. Robbins' in his assertion that we need climate and the environment to become the unspoken, understood, taken for granted context for social discourse in the way the jobs and the economy are now. I think that's a very good point. We must, in fact, take it into ourselves, the urgency of the situation where we are, but also, and this is where I recover the hope, also sustain and support the good initiatives that are taking place. I think the centre's pillars, the 4 pillars of research, education, engagement, and journalism, are all areas that require attention if we're to succeed in relation to climate. There's something else about it as well. I must say, it's a function of that. I would say to the students who will be starting, and the younger people very much, what a great place to be putting your energy. But taking Dr. Robbins' part about it being the natural thing, that we have built it into ourselves, this new awareness, the experience of this climate change. Can you just think, for example, how easily people fly out on the video, the inflation figures? But this is why, in fact, it must it must acquire the status within communication, what is happening in relation to the environment. But I think as well that it must be not only described in relation as a response to what I have described as great urgency, but an opportunity for the deployment of energy. The return to a relationship with nature is an empowering one. It is at the root of the best forms of spiritual activity. I think as well, there is no doubt, I think that citizen engagement, which is and democratic participation are core to the climate challenge. And I'm very happy that you have seen fit to include a third pillar, that third pillar in relation to the theme of engagement. The centre has an opportunity to build on and scale up current activities. I'm aware of some of them very close to here that I have visited, in which people are doing things in communities, giving practical effect to what I've been speaking about. Journalism I've spoken about. I think one of the good things that when you think of the difference between what is good news that is happening in journalism is the importance of local radio. And I think the idea of having a news service and exchanging environmental news and using local media, local radio and others is very, very important. It's wonderful capacity for making connection with the best of what is happening in communities. I am conscious as I move from that mention of the media, the problem that I have to say is that this incredible disaster being imposed, let us say, on the people of Ukraine, is in a way now, in getting coverage, is distracting us, is also serving as well as something that is displacing what our correct concern in relation to other things that are happening that are violent as well. I was present with late Sally O'Neill Sanchez of Trugra in helping to make a documentary during the Somalian famine. And yet I see at the same time as I'm looking at the horror that is happening, I'm looking at what is happening in relation to Somalia and what is happening in relation to the pastoralists and what is people dragging their dead animals across the depleted soil. Also, as well as that, the inadequacy of the responses, all of those in relation to the development. I remember suggesting a long time ago that instead of replacing where great tragedies like the loss of animals in the pastoral societies of Africa, is that we should be enabling the animals to be replaced rather than simply offering money only and asking people to move to urban centres, which just simply didn't work. And this is one of the things that's amazing in the university system, the neglect of anthropology. Anthropology, that great tool of colonization and of empire in the 19th century, used by all of the great imperial powers. And yet after freedom in so many of the countries in 1960, the failure to use anthropology as a tool for understanding differences in ethnicity, dealing with that immense crucifixion of a problem that was posed by departing empires, drawing arbitrary lines across the face of Africa. And these are things that can be changed. There can be a return to development studies and development theory being reconstituted in a way that it will have the capacity to respond to what I have been describing. I want to thank all those staff as well who have been involved in the bringing of this centre into being, staff and students. I think they will be thanked in the future for what they're doing in reconstructing a road back to harmony with nature. As I said, I think as well, it is, I'm afraid, undeniable that in terms of issues of generational justice, that future generations, if we fail, will describe our present times as really, I think it is once in terms of criminal damage. I think Ireland in 2019, we know, has become the second country in the world to declare climate and biodiversity emergency, recognising the critical nature and scale of the challenge facing us all. And I think the 2020 programme from government committed Ireland to becoming a climate neutral economy by 2050. And this, of course, is enshrined in the legislation which I signed, the Climate Action Act of 2021. But it must now be brought into being. Becoming climate neutral, I think we might have underestimated the dramatic changes that are required in personal and collective behaviours, including how we work, how we heat our homes, how we travel, produce our food, consume goods and services, and manage our waste. All of this is dealt with, I think, in the Climate Action Plan of 2021. But I think what is necessary is that all of the constituent parts of our society will have to take on the task with urgency of meeting these extraordinary challenges. I think as well the centre's purpose and the way that it has structured itself will, I think, create a kind of what we might call environmentally literate citizens, which is important. And what's always astonishing in many, many ways, it's easier than it was before, because I think younger people are better informed by science. But we shouldn't neglect as well as that there is a very old wisdom there. When one looks at Old and Middle Irish, you look at sometimes point out, for example, that the words for sexual activity in the Irish language are much wider than in the English language. But it is not unrelated to the fact that it was a language that was very, very, very interested and respectful in nature itself. And that's why you have, in fact, across different aspects of our life and in different aspects of biodiversity, you have this wonderful, wonderful legacy in the Irish language. And I often think about those languages that are dying on the continent of Africa. It is just simply a fact that their simple multiplicity of languages is that when a language dies, a whole history of experience and of humanity goes with it. Because the instinct to have a dominant language is just that. It is an act of domination. Again, more of that on another day. I think that what is just so important as well is that this is in relation to the changes in education. It's important that they merge between primary, secondary, and third level. But I mentioned older wisdom as well. there are, at my age, many cases, and it's easy for people to be younger than at this stage. There are many people who struggled to bring knowledge, to bring awareness of nature and its importance, and who are there and who are very supportive. That is one of the great benefits of Ireland coming through COVID and elsewhere, was that we didn't have false intergenerational divisions. The idea, therefore, in relation to climate and responding to it, it will require people of all ages. It is, of course, a global issue, a national issue, and a local issue. I think, as well, where there is that points, and I won't elaborate it because I think most people in this room are aware of it. If you take about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, very, very often it's described as a set of, the spinning jenny and the whole way in which, if you like, between the period of 1760 to 1830, it took off as well. There was nothing, it was built, there was a context that made it possible. And there is a context that made it become admired as a form of modernization. And it was not unrelated to trade and colonization, and indeed empire as well. But then I think what has been also was because of its presentation of more than uncritiqued modernism, was the great errors of the modernization model, was that it was something that was released into the world as a source of progress and the future, the myth of progress. In 1966, when I went to the United States to study postgraduate in sociology, along with many Latin American people whom I met for the first time that time, we were being invited to study the backwardness of our society. People were talking about development as like the images of a car moving into gear, obstacles to growth. And obstacles to growth were everything that was neglected in anthropology, the way that people lived, ancient wisdoms, relationships to the environment or whatever. Removing there's a famous Princeton set of studies about six, Gabriel Ammon, Verba, Huntington, all of these and the rest of them. And they are all addressing this. And the great concession that's made as things went on, as maybe it's a spectrum, that we're just at the bottom of a spectrum. But that is what gave us where we are now. And what was there, this is my question of you must amplify social science and social studies with philosophy. That's what gave us the inadequate theory. That gave us what was in fact actually a hidden ideological imposition of modernization theory that darkened most of the South, including law, including right across the board. Norman Long is probably the best source of all of this in the history of it. But have we the capacity, therefore, to question it? We haven't had really adequately so forth. I think that what is continued, if we neglect if we don't change, if we don't have the paradigm shift, we're going to see deepening stress in global communities, shortages in resources. I mentioned Somalia because I know it, contributing to conflict, forced migration, exile. And the greatest impact of all that uncritically accepted Anthropocene excess are the people who are now paying, the people who are least responsible are paying the highest price, indigenous people, small island developing states. And I think, therefore, the situation is likely to get very much worse if we don't address, if we fail, both in terms of those population flows that are driven by conflict shifts, renewed and old hatreds and so forth, and also the opportunity taken by those who want to take a totally different view of exclusion, who will seek to invest diversity with fear and hate and exclusion and even dehumanization. I think we were making progress. It's a progress we have to recover the United Nations 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals the Paris Agreement, limited as it was, COP26 in Glasgow last year. And I sometimes say to myself, that is something that has to be borne in mind. How all of that is in fact at risk if the discourse, let us say, in relation to the future of Europe becomes an entirely militaristic one. And that is a serious danger. As somebody who's been speaking on these issues for half a century, I must say the discourse is getting one in which how often, if you did a count in relation, how frequently have we heard the word peace in recent times? How frequently have we really critiqued the inadequacies? We use the word multilateralism, but what do we mean by it? And I think there is evidence of a considerable institutional failure there, both in terms of institution and diplomatic practice. I want to move to being a bit more cheerful about it all now and say I did have the great privilege, and think writing the foreword to Father Kirby's book, his book on polyany. And I have been an admirer of P.J. Drudy and people like that, and others a long time ago. I've been an admirer of Polanyi's approach to Carl Polanyi's approach to economics for a very, very long time. I think in it you will see, the other I think is Ian Gough's Heat, Greed and Human Need, which shows us in many cases that it is possible by changing the scholarship that informs the policies, that it will in turn change the outcomes, to be able to deal with issues of hunger, issues of great and gross inequality, and climate ecological responsibility taken together. And Ian Gough's work is seminal in that regard, in my view. And what is equally important are those who, along with him, are pointing out is just think of where we were before COVID. There was a significant argument of people who have now ran to the bushes, who more or less said that the role of the state must be kept minimal, that it must be that the market has the capacity to handle all of our problems, getting the state out of the way. And yet in every significant area, it was the state that responded to the COVID crisis. And in relation, as I look across the legislation of different countries, the state's leadership is crucial. This is not to say that everybody shouldn't be involved, but it is a direct contradiction of the market theory hegemonists who were just simply saying that the state was costly, that the state was too large, and so forth. It's a discourse that hasn't entirely died. Some of its extremists, as I said, have gone to the bushes. But they will emerge again, and it will emerge like this when they will be putting a cost on things that might be there if we are engaged in a transformation. The state had an undermining of its confidence, range, and legitimacy, which I hope is now over, because that creates a better atmosphere for hoping for the transformation that we need. The state has the capacity to deliver universal services. I have on record as saying, again, speaking to heads of state from other countries, and particularly in my visits to countries in Africa and Latin America in the past, it is a time for realizing that universal basic services, food, shelter, education, all of the things as it would be put by, what is it called, to be able to participate in your society without shame, as a distinguished Nobel economist has put it. All of these things are achievable. And universal basic services is not in contradiction of universal basic income. It is possible to give the assurance and safety of being able to belong in the world, and at the same time be able to handle difference through floors of universal basic income. I have so long, and it's in my website, the amount of tribute I have paid to people like Mariana Mazzucato, and all of these new scholars who are writing. The ideas are there. I'm thinking of Kate Robert as well, and of Oxford University and others. They've produced ways to do things. But what is standing in the way, in many cases, as these intellectually seminal works are appearing. Someone announces that they're able to buy Twitter. And you see, people must realize, if you want, in fact, actually, if you are actually morally serious about your commitment to engagement, you must realize the contradiction. Realizing the contradictions of one's life is as important as, in fact, being able to have the joy of engaging with the possibilities. That's why places like universities should be exciting places. They're not information pushing places and so forth. And they are places that will be tested by the way that people speak to each other, listen to each other with patience and so forth. All very, very, very important. I do think as well that in many cases, which in relation to there is, I said, I have spoken about the developed consciousness that is there in the area of advocacy in the ecological area. But the real challenge is merging that consciousness with the consciousness of those who have struggled, perhaps and failed, in relation to the case for social justice and equality, or responding to world hunger. What an appalling thought it is to say that if we don't respond in achieving what we have committed ourselves to, an additional 100 million people will die. We either engage in terms of including all of the people on the planet, or we compete. We fall back into a kind of isolationism. I mentioned what I had called the Cartesian fallacy. I do so by saying the world cannot be measured, and the world cannot be reduced to what is measured without great consequences. But driving all of what we went through, including our period of austerity after the collapse of 2008, was an uncritiqued individualism. And that individualism sapped into people's lives. People spoke of the I, and they spoke. I think that when I think of people like Zygmunt Bauman, who would mentioned about people being consumed in their consumption. And this, but interesting, one must ask, as I do in the things, who was criticizing this? Was the destructive emergence of what the Anthropocene has given us? Yes, there were brave people, but it's important now that the ecological responsibility lobby, the social justice lobby, and if you like, as well as that, the participation lobby in terms of dignity and the rights of everyone to participate, that they come together to achieve this paradigm shift of which I speak. I think that Father Kirby went much further, I know about it, because he was really talking about degrowth and deglobalization. But I think I do agree with him in many ways, is that what was described as globalization was very much, again, on this was very close to the original modernization theory, which was in turn very close to the idea of myth of progress, which was sustained by colonization and empire, and the assumption that some people were inferior to others. It's the most radical thing to accept and take your stand in relation to equality. I think what is recently, I think Lucas Chancel, writing on his book on sustainable inequality, social justice and the environment, current levels of income and wealth inequality are neither tolerable in a democracy nor efficient from the economic point of view. They aggravate public health risks affecting the whole of society, and they have potentially devastating consequences for the environment. Contrary to those who consciously or unconsciously insist on the supposedly ironclad laws of the market, would have us believe an unending escalation of social injustices is not inevitable. Inequalities are a political choice, supported or opposed by those who are free to express an opinion on them. I think, therefore, yes, welfare states will now, if we are to take the environment in seriously, we'll have to have new policy instruments, eco-social policies that underpin an economic paradigm that is being proposed as alternative. And that those policies must simultaneously pursue both equity and social justice, as well as sustainability and sufficiency goals within an activist, innovative state, with substantial public investment in, yes, greater regulation, and yes, planning, serious, real planning in different aspects of our lives. I think as well, President Gough has said when I met him, has stated that we require tipping the balance of the economy from private to state investment is I believe, necessary. I agree with it. I think as well, in much the same way as the best welfare states in the world promote universalism as a core principle, the move to an eco-social paradigm requires a universalist mindset, as well as additional targeted measures. And then in transition, this is where, if you like, Polanyi and all of those other writers, and what they had in mind is that they were able to look at the people around them with compassion, care, kindness. And these were not regarded as irrelevant attributes. And it is the same way. There will be people in the transition who will have to have special arrangements made for them. It would be wrong if they were asked to suffer. And that is why areas in relation to income and skill and capacity are very important to be built into models. There is a sociologist whom I regard as one of the most important in Europe, one of the students of Jürgen Habermas. I'm really talking about Hartmut Rosa of Jena University. In his wonderful book, Resonance, and he speaks about as if it were like you strike the strings of a violin, how we resonate with our world, and whether we resonate with pessimism or whether we resonate with joy. So to me, it is very important. When I discussed his book with Rosa, I said I preferred, because I was more traditional in a way, to write of this challenge as a challenge of belonging. How people looking through their lives will look. They look at some of the great joys are impulses to belong. But an impulse to belong can also be destructive, because in a way it is a suggestion that if you haven't made it to the center of the context of belonging, you have somehow or another failed. And it is there in a way then, when societies like that, this is how you do. If you measure your society by the sense of well-being, not just regarding GNP as the single measure of everybody, you then move, you can see how this all fits together in relation to transformative economic policy, ecological responsibility, inclusion, and a sense of belonging. Professor Rosa wrote in his book, From the Act of Breathing to the Adoption of Culturally Distinct Worldviews, all the great crises of modern society, ecological, democratic, psychological, can be understood and analysed in terms of resonance and our broken relationship to the world around us. In one of my own poems long ago, I wrote about my poem, I think, Too Close to the Ground. And it was about the word scenery. People in Galway and others were saying, there's great scenery. And I remember it as a child walking after cattle to the fair in 6 Mile Bridge, and bringing, the most depressing thing was bringing them home unsold. And I said, our gaze was too close to the ground. And therefore there are people. This is the disaster of unequal society. There are people who are deprived of being able, others can speak of the sun going up and it's coming down again, and of sunrise and sunlights and so forth. It's deprived from so many others, the fullness of life. And when I was discussing with Hartmut Rosa his book, it was shortly after the death of Zygmunt Bauman, who had given the title to his book, Consuming Life. So I think Bauman said, with the advent of liquid modernity, the society of producers is transformed into a society of consumers. In this new consumer society, individuals become simultaneously the promoters of commodities and the commodities they promote. They become absorbed and attached and consumed in the commodity. And that is what is wrong with single individuals, as it were, seeking to take over what should be the mind of other people in relation to communication. I believe that this catastrophe is of resonance, as Harper Rosa called it to me, which we have witnessed in modern times, is sourced in a growing narcissism, an aggressive individualism, an emphasis on insatiable consumption and wealth accumulation. How much do they want? I used to say, darling Claire, that would say about the grazier who was gone past any kind of real farming. He wants to put his arms around everything. It's a good phrase. I think as well as that, I think all of that, those tendencies are at odds with the best aspirations of social justice, solidarity, and fairness principles. Good principles that have been adopted as the base of the Sustainable Development Goals and indeed the United Nations 20th Agenda. So we're challenged now to dare not just to dream, but to bring into being a world where, as Tim Jackson puts it in his book, Post-Growth, relationships and meaning that take precedence over profits and power, a world that sustains the planet and the human spirit, an uncharted terrain in which plenty isn't measured in dollars and fulfillment isn't driven by the relentless accumulation of material wealth. A more equitable and sustainable way of life is possible and culturally attainable, and we can change our course and escape the vicious circle of our current paradigm. It requires leadership, yes, but ultimately our participation and support, as has been the case in so many of the great emancipatory movements of our world. It is the people, citizens, communities, and wider society that will lead to the change. And thus, the DCU Centre for Climate and Society has a fantastic opportunity to play a key role, working across civil society, policymakers, local authorities, communities, educators, in fostering public engagement with this, the great existential issue of our era, climate change, and through the provision of research and advice that assists in crafting better policies, better communications, better literacy, more educational resources, better strategies for tackling climate change. Your centre has a unique opportunity to help with the great task of bringing people together, building the real consensus we need. It is a big responsibility to which I am sure you will rise. Agus cuim gach ra, agus banach dare, san ober shinamaker sulagi dantaki. So it is with the greatest pleasure I wish the Centre for Climate and Society and its staff and students and everyone who will support it every success and blessing into the future. Mille buitas.
Thank you very much, President, for that very broad, wide-ranging and stirring and address. I'm sure that if you had given it as scripted before Christmas, that we wouldn't have had the allusion to Twitter and so on in the middle. So the times change and the questions change. For me as President, I suppose I'd take out of it as the challenge and the duty of a university like ours and what we do. We say we're a university that puts people first. And in terms of people, of course, we mean not just our people, ourselves, but the broader community, the people, the place and the planet, all of those together. And the President's observations about the purpose of a university are vital. Sometimes we think of education in terms of skills and all those horrible things about future skills that we hear about again and again and again in the skills agenda, whereas really it's dispositions. And as a university, I'm always reminded of the great American philosopher John Dewey's line about, education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. and the priority and I suppose the imperative for us as a university to be a community that anticipates the world we hope that our graduates will create. And the philosophy piece, I take your point about the importance of philosophies. I'm very pleased to boast that one of our newest departments in the university is in fact a school of theology, philosophy and music together. And the library that I referred to, which was a gift of the Jesuits in Ireland in All Hallows campus, is purposefully built to house the philosophy, our philosophy library. So it's very important to us. The President's range challenges us in so many ways. I take the key point about the importance of government and the role of the state and the role of the nation in our response to the challenges, and the government particularly in terms of policy, fiscal policy, regulation, and the responsibility of the state to care for the vulnerable and the marginalised. He was optimistic for the most part, but the points he make about the demise of international rule of law, for instance, and the demise of our international institutions is scary, and we see the implications of that on a daily basis. His attention to the Cartesian error, contemporary society, kind of the reduction to measurement again, is something that even within universities that we have to fight on a daily basis. And instead, he highlights as fundamental human values of respect, law, dignity, and empathy. And they are the great kind of human values and the role of the humanities here. And as the President highlights in the importance of anthropology and the opportunity for us now for the social sciences to usher in what the President calls and to return to our relationship with nature. And his description of that, a characterization of that as a spiritual task. We must, as the President said too, some nice sound bites here that if we could use that man's platform, we could talk about the kind of reconstructing our road back to nature, which puts it very nicely, and the importance of citizens' engagement and the creation of a literate citizenry. The warning, of course, about the invisible hand is absolutely correct, and the responsibility of the state. But we can't leave it to the responsibility of the state. That, for me, the takeaway today is that DCU is a public university and we are devoted and dedicated to the public good. So we're delighted that the President has joined us today and honoured that he has launched this institute, this centre that will drive us towards that change and to restore our road and our relationship with nature. So, and I'd like to ask our guests to please be upstanding as the President leaves the room. So thank you.